The horrifying secret Sauron, hid inside Minas Morgul. LOTR lore. There is a moment in the Two Towers that most readers pass through quickly because it is surrounded by so much dread that any single detail gets swallowed by the atmosphere. Frodo, Sam and Gollum are moving in darkness past the valley gate of Minas Morgul, trying not to be seen, trying not to be felt, when the ring does something it has not done at any other point in the journey. It does not simply grow heavy. It does not simply call to its master. It surges. Tolkien writes that Frodo felt the ring as a point of savage cold, and that his hand moved toward it against his will, and that he had to physically fight his own body to keep from drawing it out and putting it on. This is not what happens at the ford of Bruinen, where the Nazgul are riding him down. This is not what happens in Shelob's lair, where ancient evil presses in from every side. This is what happens, standing still in darkness, looking at a city. The question nobody asks is why? Why there? Why that moment? Why does Minas Morgul produce a response in the ring that even direct confrontation with the Nine does not reliably match? The answer Tolkien left in the text is not a comfortable one, and it has almost nothing to do with the green light, the dead flowers, or the marching army that everyone remembers from the films. What Minas Morgul actually is, once you follow every thread Tolkien laid across the Silmarillion, unfinished tales, the letters, and the appendices, is something far worse than a fortress. It is something that has no good name in our vocabulary. It is a place that had been turned into a piece of a god. Not inhabited by a god, not commanded by a god, turned, deliberately, architecturally, over the course of nearly 1,000 years, into an extension of Sauron's own diminished and desperate being, nailed to the face of the world at the exact point where it would do the most damage, designed not just to endure, but to persist even in defeat. The ring surged because it recognized its maker, not from a distance, from inside the walls. This is not speculation pulled from nowhere. This is what the text actually says when you follow it all the way down. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Let us begin with what Minas Morgul was before it became what it was, because the corruption of that city is not just a tragedy of place, it is a blueprint, and understanding what was done to it requires understanding precisely what kind of being did the doing. Minas Ithil, Tower of the Moon. It was built by Isildur, brother to Anarion, in the years of Gondor's first founding, set into the mountains of the Ephel Duath as a watchtower and a light against the shadow of Mordor. Tolkien describes it in the appendices to The Return of the King as one of the great architectural achievements of Númenórean craft in Middle-earth, a city of white stone and silver towers designed to catch the light of the moon and throw it back doubled. It sat in a valley that, in those early years, was green and living, threaded through with streams. It held one of the 7 Palantiri, the Ithil stone, the seeing stone placed there by the founders to maintain communication with Minas Anor, the Tower of the Sun, across the Pelennor. 2 cities, twin lights, one watching east, one watching west, with a stone in each that could show the other's face. Then the Nazgul came. The appendices of The Return of the King record the date, Third Age 2002. The Nazgul, the 9 ring wraiths, led by the Witch King of Angmar, besieged and captured Minas Ithil after a 2-year siege. Isildur and his family escaped. The city did not. From that point forward it was renamed Minas Morgul, the Tower of Sorcery, and it became, in Tolkien's words, an evil place. The Palantir fell into enemy hands. The valley began to change. The city began to change. Here is what nobody asks about that conquest. The Nazgul did not simply occupy a city. They held it. For nearly 1,000 years, 9 beings who are not, in any meaningful sense, alive in the way we understand living. Pay attention to this next part, because this is where the horror becomes something other than aesthetic. Tolkien establishes in The Fellowship of the Ring, in the chapter where Frodo first encounters the ring-wraiths, and more explicitly in Galadriel's Mirror chapter, that the Nazgul exist in two states simultaneously. They are partially present in the physical world and partially resident in what Tolkien calls the wraith world, the unseen dimension that underlies physical reality. This is what makes them invisible without their robes. This is what makes the Black Breath a spiritual contamination rather than a physical poison. This is why Aragorn must use Athelas, the king's foil, to pull Faramir and Éowyn and Merry back from the threshold they have been pushed toward. They have been touched by something that does not belong to the living world. They have been contaminated by proximity to the wraith world itself. Now picture this: 9 such beings, not visiting, not passing through, but enthroned in a city for close to a millennium, walking its corridors, standing in its towers, looking out from its windows, breathing, if breathing is even the right word, through its stones every hour of every year for 978 years. What does that do to a place? There is no passage in Tolkien that asks this question explicitly. But there is an answer, embedded in the cosmological rules he established. And once you see it, every detail of Minas Morgul clicks into alignment like tumblers in a lock. The Nazgul are not independent beings making their own choices. Tolkien's Letter 246 is unambiguous on this point. He writes that the ring-wraiths have no will of their own, that they exist as extensions of Sauron's will, animated by his purpose, focused by his intent. They are, in the most literal sense available to Tolkien's cosmology, Sauron's will wearing physical husks, which means that a city ruled by 9 such beings is not a city with 9 powerful tenants. It is a city through which Sauron himself is present, continuously, at 9 simultaneous focal points, radiating outward from each of them into the stones and air and soil around them. 978 years. Think about what that means, not strategically, cosmologically. In Tolkien's world, the Maiar, the angelic order to which Sauron belongs, retain the ability to invest portions of their native power into physical matter. This is not an interpretation. This is the explicit mechanism behind the Rings of Power, stated clearly in the Silmarillion's final chapter of the Rings of Power and the Third Age. Celebrimbor did not simply craft beautiful objects. Sauron, working through Celebrimbor's craft and deceiving him as to his true identity, poured portions of his native Maya power into those rings, creating objects that extended his influence beyond his body and his voice. The One Ring is the most complete expression of this, because Sauron poured the largest portion of his concentrated self into it. But the mechanism is the same. Sauron invests, matter receives. The invested matter becomes a vessel for his will. The 9 rings given to mortal kings worked through the same principle. The men who wore them were slowly drawn into the wraith world because the rings were saturated with Sauron's influence, and that influence does not share space with mortal life. It displaces it. It draws the wearer toward Sauron's frequency of existence, toward the unseen, toward the shadow. And here is where it gets strange. Because if the Nazgul are the end state of men who wore rings saturated with Sauron's will, and if those same Nazgul spent nearly 1,000 years radiating that same saturating influence into the physical fabric of a city, then Minas Morgul is not merely a place corrupted by evil. Minas Morgul is the end state of a city that wore 9 rings for 1,000 years. The city became a ring-wraith, not metaphorically, not atmospherically, cosmologically. The stones of Minas Morgul were drawn toward the wraith world by the same process that drew the 9 kings. Not quickly, not visibly, but inexorably. Over 10 centuries of continuous investment, the city became partially resident in the shadow world, partially unreal, partially present in that unseen dimension where the Nazgul walk and where the ring always knows where it is. Which is why Frodo's hand moves toward his chest, without his permission, when he stands in that valley. The ring is not just reacting to the presence of the Nazgul. The ring is reacting to Minas Morgul itself. It is reacting the way iron reacts to a magnet when the magnet is large enough. It is being pulled by a concentration of its maker's invested will that dwarfs anything else Frodo has encountered, short of Barad-dûr. Not because Sauron consciously put himself into the city in the precise way he put himself into the ring, but because 9 of his most powerful extensions have been pouring his frequency into that place for almost a millennium, and what has accumulated there is not an echo of Sauron's will. It is a reservoir. Now hold that thought. Because there is a second anchor embedded in this city that takes that reservoir and does something specific with it, something Sauron designed rather than simply allowed to accumulate, something that turns Minas Morgul from a place of accumulated spiritual contamination into something that functions with terrifying intentionality. We have to talk about the Palantir, the Ithil stone, because what Sauron did with that seeing stone after the fall of Minas Ithil is one of the most quietly devastating details in the entire legendarium, and it is sitting right there in Unfinished Tales waiting to be properly understood. Unfinished Tales, the essay on the Palantiri, lays out the mechanics of the seeing stones with a precision Tolkien does not always bring to bear on his own cosmological devices. The Palantiri were made by Feanor in Valinor, or possibly crafted from his designs in the early years of the kingdoms of Middle-earth, depending on how strictly you read the sources. They are not merely communication devices, the way 2 telephones are communication devices. They are linked by a deeper principle. Stones that were paired at their creation share a specific, resonant connection. They are drawn to each other's vision, the way paired instruments vibrate in sympathy. And the Ithil stone and the Anor stone were paired, one in Minas Ithil, one in Minas Anor, Minas Tirith, the Tower of the Moon and the Tower of the Sun, looking at each other across the Pelennor fields from the moment of their placement. Sauron captured the Ithil stone in Third Age 2002. Tolkien records this without elaboration, in the appendices, noting only that the stone passed into Sauron's hands when Minas Ithil fell. But Unfinished Tales tells us something critical about how Sauron used the Palantiri he possessed. He did not use them merely to see, he used them to dominate. Tolkien writes explicitly that Sauron's mastery over the stones he held was so complete that any other stone that came into contact with his could be overwhelmed by his will, the way a powerful transmitter overwhelms a weaker receiver. He used this to break Denethor. He used this to corrupt Saruman. But there is a third implication here that Tolkien does not state, but that follows directly from the rules he established. What happens to a Palantir that Sauron does not just contact through, but holds permanently, in a city already saturated with his invested will, surrounded by 9 focal points of his power, for nearly 1,000 years? Picture this. The chamber of the Ithil stone, somewhere in the highest tower of Minas Morgul, in a room that has not seen natural light since the siege. The stone is dark in its cradle, but it is not sleeping. It has not slept in centuries. It is being breathed through, constantly, by a will that does not sleep, cannot sleep, does not know what sleep means. The Witch King does not use the stone to communicate. He uses it to focus. Every hour of his presence in that tower, every outpouring of Sauron's will through his body and his ring, passes through the Ithil stone, the way light passes through a lens, and the lens focuses it, concentrates it, sends it along that old resonant channel carved between the stones at their making, directly across the valley, directly through the walls of Minas Tirith, directly into the Anor stone that sits in Denethor's tower. Sauron did not wait for Denethor to pick up the Anor stone. He had been transmitting into it for centuries. Every steward who had the courage or the foolishness to look into the Anor stone before Denethor did not encounter a neutral instrument. They encountered a stone that had been breathing Sauron's frequency for 900 years. The corruption Denethor experienced was not the result of a single wrong decision. It was the culmination of 1,000 years of preparation. Sauron had been setting the table since Third Age 2002. Denethor merely sat down to eat. And here is what that means in the larger architecture of what Sauron built. Because the Palantir is not just a weapon against Gondor. It is the mechanism that closes the circuit. It is how the reservoir of invested will accumulated in Minas Morgul reaches across the valley and plants itself, invisibly, in the seat of Gondor's governance. Let us pull back for a moment and look at the full shape of what Sauron constructed here, because it requires seeing all the pieces together to understand how deliberate the architecture actually is. Minas Ithil had three things that made it valuable beyond its military position. First, it sat at the entrance to the one viable mountain pass between Gondor and Mordor, the pass of Cirith Ungol above Shelob's lair. Control of Minas Ithil meant control of that corridor, the ability to funnel or block movement between the two great powers of the Third Age. Second, it was a visible monument, visible from Minas Anor across the Pelennor, a constant presence in the eye line of Gondor's capital, which meant that whatever Minas Ithil became, whatever it projected, Minas Anor would receive. Third, it contained the Ithil stone, paired with the Anor stone, linked by a resonant channel that was literally built into both structures at their creation. Sauron, who is a Maya, who has existed since before the physical world took its current shape, who crafted the rings of power, specifically by understanding how power can be invested in matter, would have understood all three of these properties immediately when the city fell. And he would have understood something else, something that is specific to his situation in the Third Age, something that makes Minas Morgul not just strategically useful, but existentially necessary to him. Here is the thing nobody talks about when they talk about Sauron's power in the Third Age. He is diminished, substantially, permanently, cosmologically diminished. The Silmarillion tells us explicitly, in the final section describing the events of the Second Age, that when Numenor was drowned and Sauron's physical body was destroyed, along with Ar-Pharazôn's fleet, Sauron lost something he could never recover. He lost his ability to take a fair form. He lost his ability to reshape his native being freely. This is not just an aesthetic limitation. This is a statement about the depth of Sauron's investment in his own deceiving form, about how much of his native Maya power he had already spent in the long project of corruption and dominion. When that form was destroyed, he could not rebuild it to its former strength. He returned to Middle-earth at reduced capacity. He still built Barad-dûr. He still forged the One Ring. He is still, in the Third Age, terrifying beyond comprehension. But there is a specific problem he now faces that he did not face in the First Age, when he was Morgoth's lieutenant, with access to the full reserves of the first Dark Lord's power, or in the early Second Age, when he was at his own peak. The problem is this: his reach is limited. Not his power within his reach, but the geographic and spiritual radius within which that power can be effectively exerted. The One Ring extends that reach significantly, which is why Isildur's refusal to destroy it is catastrophic in a way that goes beyond military defeat. But even with the One Ring, Sauron is anchored primarily to Barad-dûr. His vision ranges wide, but his investment, the actual cosmological bleeding of his Maya essence into matter, requires proximity. Minas Morgul solves this problem. Or rather, Sauron built Minas Morgul to solve this problem. Think about what a second anchor point means for a Maya operating at reduced capacity, working through proxies because his ability to personally inhabit the physical world is compromised. Barad-dûr is his seat. The One Ring is his concentrated self. The Nazgûl are his extended will, but all of these are either in Mordor or moving through Middle-earth at his direction. Minas Morgul is something different. Minas Morgul is a fixed point of his will, embedded in Gondor's face, not in Mordor. Not behind his own walls, in the territory of his enemy, visible from their capital, breathing his presence into their land, contaminating their geography. saturating their soil, and connected by a 1,000-year-old resonant channel directly into the heart of their governance. This is not a military fortress with a spooky aesthetic. This is a beachhead of Sauron's metaphysical self, planted on the enemy's doorstep and left to grow for 10 centuries. And now we come to the dead light. Because everything I have just described is the architecture behind what Tolkien depicts in those extraordinary paragraphs in the chapter The Stairs of Cirith Ungol. The description of the light that comes from Minas Morgul is not incidental horror writing. It is Tolkien encoding, in the language of image and sensation, the cosmological reality of what the city has become. He writes that the light illuminated nothing. Pause on that. Light that illuminates nothing is not darkness, and it is not ordinary light. It is something else. In Tolkien's world, where physical phenomena regularly encode spiritual realities, a light that illuminates nothing is a light that belongs to the wrong world. Physical light, the light of Arda, the light that descends from the two trees through the sun and moon, reveals the physical world. It makes things present, visible, real. A light that illuminates nothing is a light that belongs to the wraith world, where seeing does not work the way it works here, where the Nazgul can perceive the ring clearly, while being blind to almost everything a living creature can see. Minas Morgul, after 1,000 years of saturation, has begun to emit light that belongs to the other side. The city is broadcasting, not intentionally, not consciously, not like a signal sent by a general to his troops. Broadcasting the way a radioactive element broadcasts, simply by being what it is, simply by existing in a state that bleeds outward. The light of Minas Morgul is the overflow of a city that has been pulled so far toward the wraith world that it can no longer contain the wraith world's properties within its stones. They leak. They pour out through the windows and the parapets and the gate, and they fall on the valley below, and the flowers grow in it, and twist into something that looks like life, but pulls toward death. The narcotic flowers. Remember those. Tolkien is specific about them. The blooms in the valley around Minas Morgul smell sweet and poisonous, and their effect on Frodo, Sam, and Gollum is a heaviness, a near sleep, a pulling downward. Aragorn, in The Return of the King, describes the black breath as a drawing toward darkness, a spiritual undertow that the Athalas partially reverses by strengthening the spirit's connection to the living world. The flowers in the valley around Minas Morgul produce the same undertow by proximity and scent alone. You do not need to encounter a Nazgul to be pulled toward the shadow world in that valley. You only need to breathe. The geography for a mile around Minas Morgul has become an extension of wraith presence. Picture this: a traveler who does not know what Minas Morgul is, who comes through those mountains in the dark before the War of the Ring, drawn by some necessity to cross the pass of Cirith Ungol. They drop into the valley. The flowers are blooming, which seems wrong because it is night, but the light from the city is enough, and it is always night in this valley, in some sense that is hard to name. The traveler breathes the air, becomes heavy, sits down for a moment to rest. The heaviness does not lift. The city is not looking at them, not the way the Nazgul would look, not with that shrieking, focused malevolence. The city is simply being what it is, bleeding what it bleeds, and the traveler dissolves into it the way a leaf dissolves into a river, without drama, without rupture, simply by being present in something larger and more patient than any individual intention. They are found later, by something. The city has many servants. This is what the dead light means. This is what the narcotic flowers mean. This is what it means for a place to be partially resident in the wraith world. Not that monsters live there, not that evil men walk its streets, but that the place itself has become a weapon, operating continuously, without direction, without individual malice, simply by being what Sauron made it. And that brings us back to the Witch King. Because understanding what Minas Morgul actually is requires understanding why the Witch King was placed there, what his function in that city was, and what the relationship between the greatest of the Nazgul and the city of Wraithlight actually looks like from the inside. The Witch King of Angmar is the most powerful of the 9. Tolkien is clear on this. He is described in the appendices as the Captain of Morgul, the Lord of the Nazgul, and the Unfinished Tales section, The Hunt for the Ring, adds critical detail. Sauron's strategic coordination of the Nazgul's movements in the year of the Ring's hunt was conducted through the Witch King at Minas Morgul. The Witch King did not receive orders and dispatch riders. He was the command node. He was the point through which Sauron's will was focused and transmitted to the other 8. Which means Minas Morgul was not just saturated by 9 Nazgul simultaneously. It was the place where Sauron's will was amplified through the 9, where the command structure of his most powerful servants operated as a concentrated instrument. The Witch King in Minas Morgul is not a general in a castle. He is the focusing lens for a power that flows from Barad-dûr and exits through 8 other wraith bodies as directed force. And this has a specific implication for the Palantir. Because if the Witch King is the focal point through which Sauron's will is amplified and directed, and if the Palantir is the mechanism through which that focused will is transmitted across the valley into Gondor's governance, then the Witch King's presence in Minas Morgul over 1,000 years is not separate from the corruption of the Anor Stone in Minas Tirith. It is the power source. The Witch King is the transformer. The Ithil Stone is the antenna. The resonant channel between the paired stones is the wire, and the Anor Stone in Denethor's hands is the receiver. Sauron built a circuit, one end in Barad-dûr, amplified through 9 rings, focused through the Witch King. Transmitted through the Ithil Stone, down the 1,000-year channel, into the Anor Stone, into Denethor's hands, into Gondor's mind. The corruption of Denethor was not an opportunistic use of a vulnerable man. It was the terminal destination of a system Sauron had been building since the day Minas Ithil fell. Now here is where the central question of all of this becomes genuinely haunting, because we have established what Minas Morgul is. A reservoir of invested will, a wraith world anchor, a cosmological broadcast tower, a circuit element in a system designed to corrupt Gondor from within. And we have established how it was built. Through 1,000 years of Nazgul saturation, Palantir focusing, and Sauron's continuous investment through his 9 most powerful servants. The question is, what happened to all of that when the War of the Ring ended? The One Ring was destroyed. Everyone knows this. Barad-dûr fell. Everyone knows this. The Nazgul were unmade in the fire above the crack of doom. Their ring sustained existence, ending with the destruction of the One Ring that gave the 9 their power. Everyone knows this. But here is what nobody asks. The Nazgul were unmade. Barad-dûr fell. The One Ring was destroyed. But Minas Morgul was not unmade. It was not destroyed. It was captured, briefly occupied by the armies of the West before Aragorn ordered it burned and demolished. Notice the specific word, demolished, not purified, not sanctified, not restored. Demolished. Aragorn, who is Dúnedain, who understands more about the nature of wraith contamination than almost any living man, who used Athelas to pull the Black Breath victims back from the shadow, who knew exactly what the Nazgul were and what their proximity did to living things. He did not attempt to cleanse Minas Morgul. He burned what could be burned and pulled the walls down. The question you are now asking yourself is the right one. Can you demolish something that is partially resident in a dimension other than the physical one? Let us think about this carefully, because the answer has implications that reach into everything we have just built. When a man who wore a ring of power died, the ring did not stop existing. The ring endured. The power invested in the ring was not destroyed by the death of the wearer. It required the destruction of the One Ring to unmake them, and even that unmaking was an unraveling of Sauron's will rather than a simple physical event. The principle is consistent across the legendarium. Things into which Sauron has invested his power persist beyond the destruction of the vessel unless the source of that investment is itself destroyed. The One Ring destroyed, Sauron's will unraveling, the 9 unmade. Does that unraveling reach backward into Minas Morgul? Does it drain the reservoir? Does it close the wound? Here is what the text tells us. Aragorn burns Minas Morgul and orders its ruins left desolate. No one returns to rebuild it. The appendices note that Faramir, as Prince of Ithilien, takes stewardship of the land around it, and that eventually some restoration of life in Ithilien is achieved under his governance. The flowers of Ithilien, which Sam remembers with love from earlier in the journey, eventually return to something like their former state. Life comes back to the land, which suggests that the broadcast, the continuous bleeding of wraith presence into the geography, does diminish with the unmaking of the Nine. But the resonant channel between the Ithil stone and the Anor stone, what happens to that? Unfinished Tales tells us that the Anor stone was buried with Denethor in the tombs of the stewards, and that it was considered too corrupted and too dangerous for any future use, that Aragorn, as king, declined to employ it. The Ithil stone's fate is not recorded. Tolkien does not tell us what happened to it. Given that Minas Morgul was demolished, it may have been buried under the rubble. It may have been thrown into the Morgul Duin, the pale stream that ran poison from beneath the city's gate. It may have been recovered and sent to Rivendell or Valinor with the other remnants of the Age's power, though there is no record of this. And the absence of a record is itself the most unsettling fact in this entire investigation. Because the Ithil stone did not stop being a Palantir when the Witch King was unmade. The rings of power persisted after the deaths of their bearers. The physical objects Sauron invested into did not lose their investment simply because circumstances changed around them. The Ithil stone, if it survived the demolition of Minas Morgul, is still a Palantir. It is still paired with the Anor stone. It is still the stone that Sauron breathed through for 1,000 years, that channeled the concentrated will of 9 ringwraiths, that served as the focusing antenna for the slow corruption of Gondor's governance. The demolition of the city around it does not change what it is. The unmaking of the Nine removes the source of new investment, but the investment that accumulated across 10 centuries does not simply evaporate. Picture this: the ruins of Minas Morgul, decades after the War of the Ring. Faramir's people have begun tentative restoration of Ithilien. Green things are returning to the valley, slowly, unevenly. The pale stream runs clearer than it did. The narcotic flowers are gone, replaced in places by the ordinary flowers Sam remembered, the Nifredil and Eleanor of the gentler lands. Birds have returned to the western slopes of the Ephel Duath. Everything looks like healing. Everything looks like the wound is closing. Somewhere under the rubble of the demolished tower, in the darkness where no light reaches, wraithworld or otherwise, a round stone sits in the dust. Its surface is dark. It has been dark since the fires above the crack of doom, since the moment the Nine were unmade and the will flowing through them ceased. But darkness in a Palantir is not the same as emptiness. Tolkien is clear that the stones retain what they have been made to hold. They are not memories in the way living minds hold memories, recoverable on demand, but they are shaped by what has passed through them. The Anor stone was shaped by Sauron's dominance over centuries of contact. The Ithil stone was shaped by 1,000 years of being a conduit for that dominance amplified through 9 wraith lords. Anyone who picked it up now, in the Fourth Age, in the years of supposed healing, would not find a neutral instrument. They would find something that has been, for its entire existence in Middle-earth, a receiver and broadcaster of Sauron's frequency. The question of whether that frequency is still present, still active, still capable of reaching across the old resonant channel into the buried Anor stone in Denethor's tomb, is a question Tolkien does not answer. He does not answer it. But he built a world with consistent rules. And the consistent rule is that things invested with Sauron's power do not simply stop being what they are. Which brings us, finally, to the deepest layer of what Minas Morgul actually was, and what its continued existence in the ruins says about the nature of victory in Tolkien's world. There is a tendency, when discussing the conclusion of The Return of the King, to understand the defeat of Sauron in purely military terms, or even in purely metaphysical terms, centered on the ring. The ring is destroyed. Sauron is unmade. The Third Age ends. The world is healed. This is not wrong. But it is incomplete in a way that matters. Because Sauron was not just the One Ring. He was not just Barad-dûr. He was not just the Nazgul. He was a Maya who had spent thousands of years investing his power into matter, into objects, into places, into minds, into chains of causation that would persist long after any individual moment of defeat. The Silmarillion tells us, in a passage that is easy to read as cosmological background and easy to miss as practical statement, that Sauron's great strategy in the Second and Third Ages was always to embed himself in the world so deeply that his destruction would require something the world was unwilling to pay. The One Ring was the concentrated expression of this strategy, but Minas Morgul was the distributed expression of it. Not all his eggs in one basket. Some of his essence concentrated and portable in the ring. Some of it diffused and embedded in a city, in a Palantir, in a resonant channel, in the soil of a valley, in the accumulated thousand-year saturation of a place that Gondor could see from its capital, every single day. Sauron built redundancy into his own cosmological self. Because a Maya who had already been destroyed once, whose physical form had already been annihilated in the drowning of Númenor, understood something that Morgoth never fully grasped, that you survive defeat by being distributed, by being present in so many places and things and minds that no single catastrophe can reach all of them at once. Gandalf understood this. Not perfectly, not with the clarity that full knowledge would provide, but enough to understand why the Nazgul could not simply be fought as military opponents, why Minas Morgul could not be assaulted from across the valley, why the geography of evil in Middle-earth was not a collection of bad places, but a system, an interlocking web of invested will designed by a mind of terrible intelligence and deep patience. And here is the part that is genuinely devastating if you have followed everything we have built to this point. Gandalf also understood, before the War of the Ring, that the destruction of the One Ring would not restore the world to what it was before Sauron's corruption. He understood that the Third Age was ending, and that what came after would be a world permanently marked by everything Sauron had done to it. He said, essentially, that the elves would diminish and go into the West, and that Middle-earth would be less, not just because of who would leave, but because of what would remain. The corruption of places like Minas Morgul, the corrupted Palantiri, the wounds in the world's fabric that 1,000 years of wraith presence carved, and that no victory, however complete, could fully close. Let me say that plainly. The Fellowship walked to Mount Doom and destroyed the ring and unmade Sauron and saved the world. And the world they saved was permanently, cosmologically altered by what it had survived, not just scarred. Altered, changed in its deep structure, in the way the wraith world presses against the living world, in the way certain places hold a resonance that the living cannot fully perceive, but that the living cannot fully escape either. Picture this: Arwen, years after the War of the Ring, standing on the walls of Minas Tirith in the morning, looking east across the Pelennor, toward the distant smear of the Ephel Duath. The mountains are quiet. The valley that held Minas Morgul is a ruin, and there are green things growing in it, which is good, which is healing. But Arwen, who is half-elven, who perceives both the physical and the deeper layered world that elves see beneath it, does not look at that valley the way a mortal would. She sees what is growing. She also sees what is still there beneath the growth. The resonance does not vanish because the stones are tumbled. The saturation of a millennium does not drain away in a decade of sun and rain. She can feel, at this distance, in the way that elves feel the histories of places, that the valley is not the same as it was before the city, that it will not be the same in her lifetime, perhaps not in the lifetime of the world. and she turns away from the east and goes back inside, and she does not speak of what she felt, because some things require a language for which the living world has no words yet. Tolkien understood this. He understood it specifically and built it into the emotional architecture of the end of The Lord of the Rings. The world is saved. The world is also permanently lesser than it was, not because of who leaves, because of what was done to it and what remains in the doing. Minas Morgul is the most complete expression of this principle in the entire legendarium, not because it is the most powerful thing Sauron built. He built the One Ring, he built Barad-dûr. Those were greater concentrations of his will, but they were destroyed or they fell. Minas Morgul was demolished and left in its ruins, its Palantir unaccounted for, its resonant channel between the paired seeing stones never explicitly severed, its thousand-year saturation of the surrounding geography addressed with fire and time rather than with any cosmological remedy that Tolkien describes. The armies of the West won the battle. The ring was destroyed. The enemy was cast out, and they left the wound open. Not from carelessness, not from ignorance, from necessity, and from the unavoidable truth that some corruptions, once achieved at sufficient depth, cannot be fully undone by any power available in Middle-earth. The power required to undo them was spent in the Age of Trees and the wars of the First Age and the drowning of Númenor. What remains is enough to resist and endure and rebuild. It is not enough to restore, which is why Aragorn orders the ruins left desolate rather than cleansed. He knows, in the way a Dúnedain ranger who has spent decades in the wild places of Middle-earth, and who carries the lore of his people in his blood, knows things that cannot be fully articulated, that there is no cleansing for what Minas Morgul became. You can remove the Nine, you can demolish the towers, you can wait for the flowers to die and for new flowers to grow in their place. But the wound in the fabric of that valley, the place where the wraith world and the living world pressed against each other for 1,000 years until they partially merged, does not seal with the end of the war. It scar over, like all wounds scar over. But a scar is not healed skin, it is a permanent record of damage. And what Minas Morgul left in the world is the most extensive scar in all of Middle-earth's Third Age geography, precisely because it was not accident or battle but deliberate design. The work of a Maya of terrible intelligence building himself a second home in enemy territory and leaving it to grow for 10 centuries undisturbed. This is the secret Sauron hid inside Minas Morgul. Not a treasure, not a weapon in any conventional sense. Himself, a piece of his diminished but still vast and ancient self, invested into the stones and air and Palantir and 9 saturated fabric of a city that Gondor could see from its capital every day, that Gondor's own seeing stone was resonantly connected to, that Gondor's own soldiers had to march past to defend the pass of Cirith Ungol, that the Fellowship had to creep past in darkness to even begin their final approach to Mordor. Sauron hid himself in a city, and he pointed that city at the heart of everything that opposed him, and he left it there, breathing and bleeding and broadcasting, for nearly 1,000 years. And when the war was over, and the armies of the West marched through that valley, what they thought they were capturing was a fortress. What they were actually walking into was a wound that Sauron had spent a millennium carving into the world's living body. And they demolished the stones, and they left the valley desolate, and they waited for time to do what power could not fully accomplish. And the world healed, as much as it could. Ithilien bloomed again. Faramir and Éowyn built a home there, which is either the most courageous thing in the entire epilogue or the most haunting, depending on how carefully you have read everything that preceded it. Now we arrive at the question that everything in this investigation has been building toward. Not the same question I asked at the beginning, though it begins in the same place. The question is heavier now. You have earned the full weight of it. At the beginning, I asked why the ring surges in Frodo's hand when he stands before Minas Morgul. The answer, having followed every thread, is this. Because the city is saturated with the same maker's signature as the ring, the same frequency of invested Maya will, the same essential quality of Sauron in matter that the ring contains in concentrated form. The ring recognized its maker's presence, not in Barad-dûr's distant shadow, but right there, in the stones around them, in the air, in the dead light pouring out of the gate. But the deeper question is this. If Minas Morgul was Sauron's attempt to solve the problem of a Maya whose ability to inhabit the physical world directly had been permanently compromised, a second anchor, a distributed self, a piece of his essence embedded in enemy territory and left to grow beyond his direct control, not controlled like Barad-dûr is controlled, but placed and then allowed to saturate, to become. If that is what the city was, then the destruction of the One Ring unmade Sauron's concentrated will. It collapsed the center, it ended the command, but what it could not do, by definition, was reach into every corner of the world where Sauron had already distributed himself and withdraw that investment, the way you might recall an army, the way you might collect scattered coins. The center collapsed. The periphery remained, changed, diminished, slowly draining of whatever active force had animated it, but present. If Sauron invested a portion of his Maya essence into Minas Morgul the way he invested into the One Ring, and the ring was destroyed but the city was only demolished, then what walked into that valley when the armies of the West marched through was not just rubble and ruin. It was the distributed remainder of a god who had learned, after his first destruction, to make himself harder to fully kill. And what precisely the armies of the West buried when they thought they had won is a question Tolkien answered in the architecture of his world's rules rather than in any single passage, and the answer the rules give is not the one that makes it easy to sleep. They buried the stones. They buried the towers. They did not bury what the towers had become. They could not. They had nothing that could do it. Nothing that could reach into the wraith world adjacent layer of a city that had been partially pulled across for 1,000 years and extract the accumulated residue of invested Maya will from geography that had absorbed it, like stone absorbs water. They won. They absolutely won. The ring was destroyed. Sauron was broken. The Third Age ended and the Fourth began, and Aragorn was king, and Gondor flourished, and the Shire recovered, and even the old forest seems to have quieted somewhat in the aftermath. The victory was real. But in a valley in Ithilien, where the flowers now grow green and the stream runs clear, and Faramir's people tend the land with love and care, there is a place where the ground is different, not visibly, not detectably by any instrument available to the Fourth Age, but in the way that places that have been put to certain uses retain those uses in their deep structure long after the immediate purpose has passed. The valley that held Minas Morgul is not the same as the valleys around it. It may never be exactly the same. The world will change further, will move beyond even the reach of what the Third Age wrought, and perhaps in thousands of years the resonance will fade as completely as the resonance of First Age battles has faded from the geography of the Northwest. Perhaps. But perhaps is not restoration. Perhaps is only the possibility of forgetting. And forgetting is not the same as healing. This is what Tolkien understood about evil, that his legendarium encodes at every level. Evil does not simply stop when you stop it. It does not vanish when you defeat the hand that wields it. It persists in the shapes it has carved, in the investments that were made before the defeat, in the places that were changed and then left to change back at their own pace, which is the pace of geology and deep time, rather than the pace of kings and wars. The victory of the Fellowship is one of the most stirring things in all of literature. It is also, read carefully, one of the most honest portrayals of what winning a war against something deeply embedded actually looks like. You stop the immediate harm, you end the active force. You leave behind the consequences, which are yours now, which belong to the world that survived, which must be lived with and worked with, and eventually, maybe, healed across an expanse of time that no individual living in the moment of victory can fully imagine. Minas Morgul is Tolkien's most concentrated image of this truth. A city that was turned into a wound and then abandoned to scar. A wound that the victors looked at and understood well enough to leave desolate and not well enough to close. A place that the armies of the West marched through on their way to a triumph that was real and complete, and not quite as total as it looked from the outside. The ring was destroyed, but Minas Morgul was only demolished. And somewhere in the silent ruins of a tower that once emitted light that illuminated nothing, in the dust of stones that once broadcast the frequency of a diminished god to anyone with the misfortune to stand beneath them, the echo of that frequency does not announce itself. It does not need to. It has learned, over 1,000 years, to be quiet. It has learned to be patient. It has learned to be something other than a presence, and settle for being a characteristic of a place, a quality of the air in a valley in Ithilien, a reason why even in the Fourth Age of Men, when everything is bright and new and Aragorn is king, and the Shire is merry, and the great darkness is broken, the deer that wander into the Valley of Morgul sometimes pause at a particular point in the road and refuse to go further, and the shepherds who tend Ithilien's recovered lands know that particular stretch of ground by another name than the one on the maps, a name they do not say after dark, a name they do not explain to outsiders, because the explanation requires a knowledge of what that valley held for 1,000 years, that most people in the Fourth Age would prefer to believe is entirely past. Whether they are right to believe that is a question Tolkien declined to answer directly. Whether the Fourth Age's quiet represents genuine healing, or only the peace of a wound that has closed on the surface while remaining open at a depth no living eye can see. I think about that question more than any other single question this legendarium raises. Not because it has an answer I can find, but because Tolkien built his world's rules in a way that makes both possibilities real, and that makes both possibilities feel true, and that leaves you sitting in the space between them, which is exactly where he wanted you. That is where the great literature lives, not in the answers. In the questions that stay with you after the last page is turned and the book is closed and you are sitting in the ordinary world, which does not have the dead light of Minas Morgul bleeding through any visible gate, but which has its own version of wounds that scar over and are called healing, and which occasionally, when you are in certain places at certain hours, feel like something you cannot name is still there, still present, still bleeding its old frequency into the air around you. Tolkien knew about those places. He built a world to show you that he knew. If this conversation opened something you want to keep following, if the idea of Minas Morgul as a cosmological instrument, rather than a Gothic castle, changed how you see the geography of the War of the Ring, I want to hear where your mind went with it. Because this is one of those corners of the legendarium where the threads go deeper the harder you pull, and I have not pulled all of them here. I have barely started on the question of what the Ithil stone's continued existence means for the paired Anor stone buried in Denethor's tomb, or on what Faramir, as a man of exceptional sensitivity, who Tolkien describes as dream-touched and far-sighted, would have felt living within sight of those ruins in the years he governed Ithilien. Some of those threads lead somewhere worth going. If you want to go there with me, stay close to this channel. We are just getting started on what Tolkien actually built beneath the story he told.